urbanization. Let's get it going. Okay, there we go. I'm starting now. Immigration. Here's what you should know. First of all, the myth versus the reality. Second, who came and when. Third, the differences between the different waves. Fourth, the immigrant experience here in the cities. Their treatment, the backlash and prejudice, and the legal opposition. Myth versus reality. Of course, that is the famous Statue of Liberty. The myth is that we welcome our immigrants with open arms. This is one of my favorite poems in American history. The key lines being, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." So the idea, the myth, is that America has been a land that has welcomed immigrants. And, I mean, that's partially true. Nicknames and phrases about America are that we are the Golden Door, the Gold Mountain, that was a Chinese name for America, the land of opportunity, the American dream. The reality is much different. Here's a quote: "The biggest thing I don't like about New York are the foreigners. Not a very big fan of foreigners. You can walk an entire block in Times Square and not hear anybody speaking English. Asians and Koreans and Vietnamese and Indians and Russians and Spanish people and everything up there. How the hell did they get into this country?" That is from 1999, Atlanta Braves pitcher. Became very famous. Americans want to believe that it's a very natural thing for people to live together, and it's an aberration when they don't. Actually, if you look at human history, the exact opposite is true. That's a quote from a documentary that we watch in the New York City class. It's very difficult to bring different cultures together, have people live together in peace, and learn to get along. We see this reality right now in 2016, the presidential race, the anti-immigrant statements being made by many of the candidates. That was more true, I'd like to emphasize that was more true in the 1800s and the turn of the century, the 1900s. Every new group that has come in seems different to the people that are already here. The new group's always misunderstood. They're generally feared and disliked, and they always face prejudice and discrimination. Believe it or not, what we are experiencing right now is actually pretty mild compared to the previous waves of immigration. Who came and when? If you look at this chart, write down how many waves of immigration you think there have been. That is the number of people who've come in by decade up through about 2004. You see it peaks around the turn of the century in the 1900s and then peaks again just slightly higher, about 9 million immigrants in the 80s and 90s. However, if you look at it by percent of the U.S. total population, it looks different. Looks like it peaked in the 1840s and 50s, and then again in the 1900s, and this modern wave of immigration seems much, much smaller. It's only about 3% of the total population. So how many waves have there been? 3. The first wave is in the 1840s and 50s. The second wave is in the turn of the century, 1880s, 1890s, 1910s. And the third wave started about 1965 with the change in the laws, and now. That first wave is massive, and it dramatically changed especially the eastern cities on the Atlantic coast. The second wave, however, is the biggest wave, as you saw, both in absolute numbers and as a percent of the population. And it is the wave that goes along with the urbanization and industrialization of the late 1800s. And this third wave we'll talk about again later, but it's been a different immigration. So who came? You could write this down, but you don't really need to. What you should get out of this is note that in the first wave, 1840s and 50s, the number 1 and number 2 groups were Irish and German. And in general, immigration came almost entirely from Northern and Western Europe. In the second wave, Germans and Irish began to decline, and it was primarily people from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. The number one country of origin was Italy. The number one group to come in were Jews from Eastern Europe, Russia, and Poland. But because they came from more than one country, Italians by themselves are a bigger group for one country. But it's not just those two groups, not just Jews and Italians. It is just a ridiculously long list of ethnic groups, languages they spoke, and religions. So that second wave is much different from the first wave. It is Spaniards, it's Italians, it is Greeks, it is Hungarians, it is Croatians and Serbians and all the Slavic peoples, it is Turkish peoples, it's Syrian, all the people around the southern part of Europe and the Mediterranean area. And then up through, Romanians and Czechs and Poles and Russians and Ukrainians, Latvians, Lithuanians, it's all those Eastern European areas, as both areas were facing tremendous amounts of poverty and tremendous amounts of oppression. And they fled the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the chaos and disorder of the late 1800s in those areas. The first and the second wave are very different. When they came, you should note that. Where they came from, I've talked about that. The journey over was very different. The first group had to sail in sailing ships, much longer journey, very dangerous, and some of them were called coffin ships because so many people died aboard. The religions seemed very different to the Native Americans who lived here. Catholicism seemed like an alien religion, and so the Irish and the Germans seemed very different, especially the Irish. However, the diversity of the second wave was stunning to people who lived in America. So they seemed even more different because they dressed more differently, more languages, like I already went through, and even more religions. What they came to was also different. Both came to the cities, but the cities of the 1850s were different from the cities of the turn of the century. Turn of the century is much more modern, with much more mechanical ways of transportation. You had the subway, you had skyscrapers, you had trolley cars, you had electricity, you started to have indoor plumbing. It was a huge gap to go from the rural villages of southern Italy or Poland and using a horse or a walking or a wagon to get everywhere, and now all of a sudden you come to these really actually very, very modern cities. So the second wave faced challenges that the first did not, although I don't want to diminish what the first group faced. What was life like here? The next 4 slides show urban slum scenes from the city. No description. Just take a moment to look at each slide, describe what you see in the scene briefly on your notes, and then note the differences. Try and guess the year that each was taken. There's the first one. Take a good look at what you see. There's the second one. Of course, you can pause these. There's the third one. And there's the fourth. Okay, let me describe them. The first one was taken in the 1880s, but the reason I included it is because it actually shows a better picture of what life was like for the first wave, the Irish and the Germans who came. Houses tended to be wooden. Everything's kind of dirty and more ramshackle. You wouldn't even necessarily have had those sidewalks. The streets are dirt. And that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-story building, that's an early tenement. You can see at that time it might be a nicer place to live. The tenements didn't start out as slum dwellings. They started out as middle-class places, and then they gradually got kind of overwhelmed the area. The middle-class families moved out, and they got crowded with more and more families. The second one, is supposed to show, this is from the 1880s, and again, it shows kind of the earlier feel of the city, the low-level buildings, and it's crowded, and everything's wooden, and you're using wagons to get around. I mean, these houses aren't wooden, but some of them are in the background. But this is more reminiscent of the earlier era. This one is obviously more modern. You've got the tenements are built up, the streets are paved, you have these pushcart salesmen all along the side of the road. It's a much busier and more congested neighborhood. And this one, the same thing, and obviously is the most modern. Both the third one and the fourth one are from the turn of the century, about 1900. This one is from exactly 1900, and they're digging up the streets to lay down the streetcar trolley lines. And you see the buildings are getting much taller in the background, and everything's more modern looking. Tenements. You see on the right the dumbbell tenement. See, before that, there was the double tenement, which had a front tenement and a rear tenement. It was actually the worst to live in. This is from the 1830s, 1850s, when they were allowed to be built. And that rear tenement, you had to walk through the first one to get there. And the yard would be just a bunch of mud with outhouses. And so you would, let's do a pen here. You're walking through, and here are the outhouses, and then the storms would come and you would get the sewage overflow because there's no real sewage, they're just dumping the feces into the ground. And so you're walking through that, and these were butt up against another tenement from the other block, and so there's actually no light anywhere in here. These were the worst to live in. So in 1850 they outlawed the double tenement, and it didn't get much better. You had this very long tenement that was again right up against another one, and so you would have no light between them. Only if you had lived in these front parlor rooms, in these front apartments, could you get much light during the day. And so they, as you know from your reading, they designed the railroad tenement, or the dumbbell tenement. It's got this air shaft, and then there would be a building next to it with a similar air shaft. We'll draw that. And it was supposed to allow much more light in. These were allowed up until 1901, and then they realized those are no better, as you got from your reading. They're a fire trap, that people dump their garbage here in the air shaft. And so in 1901 you get another new law, and the tenements are finally better. What is not clear from these dates, though, is that just dealt with when things were allowed to be built. The rear tenements, the dumbbell tenements, all of these tenements still continued as buildings once they were built long into the 1900s, to the point where you can still go down and see a number of dumbbell tenements in New York City, and they're getting less and less of them, but you can even see an occasional rear tenement. Tenement life. This is from Jacob Riis, and he talks about in a Stanton Street tenement, which is down on the Lower East Side of New York City. Came upon a capmaker's home. Little boy stood by the window, flattening his nose against the pane, gazing wistfully up. Would like to live in the front, but we can't pay the rent. And he tries to talk them into these rear view tenements, or a little bit, they're not so bad. And the girl's like, well, they have the sun out there. And he says, does the sun never come here? And he wished he hadn't said it. And the little boy's like, oh yes. Or the girl says, once every summer it comes. And it's a really sad picture, melodramatic picture of tenement life by Jacob Riis. This is a great photo. It's got the air shaft, and there is, from 1890, Jacob Riis took it. There's a bathtub hanging down. It's the only bathtub in either building, and the families would share it. And if you just think about that for a moment, you have to haul the bathtub in. There's no indoor plumbing, so you are going out to the well down outside to get water, carry that up in buckets, pour it in the tub, go down and get coal or wood to heat the fire, to heat up the water, and it's just a laborious process. It's very hard just to stay clean, and there's this myth and prejudice that the immigrants were all dirty, but it was much easier to be clean in middle class or upper class housing than it was in lower class tenements. And so the city eventually actually started building public baths, which were very popular for immigrants or poor people of whatever nationality to go and bathe for like a nickel or sometimes even free. Reaction. Nativism, you read about in your reading, the belief that non-immigrants are superior, anti-immigrant. Immigrants faced remarkable prejudice and discrimination. The Irish, I would argue, probably the biggest backlash against them, but every group faced discrimination and prejudice. However, there weren't many actual successful efforts at limiting immigration. In the 1850s, the American Party was formed, also known as the what? Right, the Know Nothing Party, but they never actually achieved any legislative successes. Throughout the 1800s, there are attempts to limit immigration, but almost all of them fail. The anti-immigrant groups were not quite united enough. They didn't have the political power. And the businesses had the political power, and they wanted the immigration for obvious reasons. They needed the labor. The only immigrant restrictions that were passed were, of course, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And in 1905, Theodore Roosevelt concluded an agreement with the Japanese government, a gentleman's agreement. It wasn't actually a law to limit Japanese immigration. So the only groups that actually get excluded are two Asian groups. And my argument would be that it's not because they came in big numbers. They actually didn't. The Chinese and Japanese immigration was very small compared to European immigration. It's that I think into the 1800s, whites, the Asians seemed more different, more foreign, and scarier. All right, that's the end of the slideshow, and I'm at 1624, not bad. We're going to stop it.